Hello and thanks for joining us from our studios in Israel. Coming up in today's newscast, the Israeli woman missing in the Berlin attack is tragically identified. Israel extends a hand to Yazidi victims of the Islamic State, and an incredible new Israeli technology has found a way to help the paralyzed move their limbs. I'm Natasha Kirchuk here with the latest news in Israel. We opened with some tragic news. Authorities in Germany have finally been able to confirm that the 60-year-old Israeli woman who's been missing since a Christmas market massacre in Berlin was killed in the attack. It was announced this morning that the body of Dalia Eliakim has been identified as one of the 12 people who died after being hit by a truck crashing through crowds at the outdoor venue 4 days ago. Her family has been informed and arrangements are being made to return her remains to Israel for burial. Eliakim had been visiting the German capital with her 60-year-old husband Rami, who was among 47 others who were hurt in the attack. An intense manhunt is underway across Europe to capture the prime suspect, a 24-year-old rejected Tunisian asylum seeker named Anis Amri, who had already been flagged as a potentially dangerous Islamist jihadist. Israeli President Reuven Rivlin says he received the news of Eliakim's death with great sadness and offers his condolences to her family and best wishes for her husband's recovery. He's also pledging that the battle against murderous terrorism will be relentlessly battled by a united global front. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is calling on the United States to exercise its veto power because today a vote will be taking place on a UN Security Council resolution that condemns all settlement activities in Israel. Aaron, thanks for joining me.
Welcome.
So give me some facts on the ground right now.
Basically, we're seeing more, as Ron Prosser used to call it, the theater of the absurd from the UN. We're seeing more of it. You have ISIS running amok in Syria and Iraq and parts of Africa. You've got, the Assad regime killing hundreds of thousands. You have Iran and North Korea advancing their weapons program, and the list goes on. And the UN just cannot stop talking about Israel. So we're seeing more of that bias. The bill was drafted by Egypt, and it demands an immediate halt of all building in Judea and Samaria, defined in the text as, quote, occupied Palestinian territory, end quote, including East Jerusalem. It also calls for the taking of affirmative steps to reverse negative trends on the ground. Washington traditionally rejects anti-Israel motions at the UN and vetoed a similar resolution in 2011. But this time, the Obama White House is declining to comment on its intended response. Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu just released a public message on Twitter urging the U.S. to veto the resolution. Israeli UN Ambassador Danny Danon is slamming the measure as the epitome of absurdity and UN hypocrisy for censoring the only democracy in the Middle East while thousands are being massacred in Syria. He's also angry that the draft makes no mention of Palestinian terrorism or incitement. Danon is echoing the Prime Minister's call for the Jewish state's greatest friend, America, to prevent such one-sided anti-Israel resolutions from being approved. Israeli Education Minister Naftali Bennett joined the motion, saying that a UN Security Council vote against Israeli settlements while killings in Syria continue is hypocrisy.
Whoever today supports a UN Security Council resolution against Israel is in effect raising his hand for the bad guys, for the terrorists, for the forces of evil. Whoever raises his hand against Israel today is supporting terrorists in Brussels, in Paris, in Orlando, in London, and yes, in Manhattan. We expect the decent, free world to support the world's #1 fighter against radical terror, Israel, not to fight us, to support us.
It looks like much of the European aid money given to Palestinians in need is being used to pay the salaries of convicted terrorists. But why is that the case? ILTV's Steve Leibowitz sat down with the head of NGO Monitor, Dr. Gerald Steinberg, who claims that it all has to do with the fact that the EU sends over money without conducting due diligence.
They all have terms which refer to international law or peace or justice or helping prisoners. All of those things are there, medical aid. The terms are all fine. If you don't do due diligence, if you don't dig a little bit and see what they're actually doing, and that's the biggest problem. In all of these European countries, I mean, Switzerland, I think we calculated something like 10 million Swiss francs, a franc and a dollar and a euro are all about the same, a year. A lot of that money goes to a group in Ramallah at Birzeit University called the International Humanitarian Law and Human Rights Secretariat at Birzeit University. And from there, a lot of that money goes to these organizations, so it's secondhand.
Is some of that secondhand money going, in effect, to pay salaries of convicted terrorists?
Okay, that's another part of that budget and another example of the failure to do due diligence. Usually the money in the European countries that we know are providing salaries to Palestinian prisoners / terrorists / families, that usually comes from a direct aid budget, not from NGO money. Either it goes to the PLO, or it goes to the Palestinian Authority, or it goes to some sort of charitable organization, in quotes. We had the case of World Vision, and we don't know where that's going right now, but where we had the allegations that the head of the Gaza branch funneled something like $40 million over 10 years to Hamas. Some of that must have gone to pay this, certainly paid terrorists and salaries and other things, salaries in quotes like that. So this failure of due diligence among the donors, and the World Vision money largely comes from the Australian government. And the Australian government did the right thing, and they suspended that funding. And their books, the World Vision books, are a mess. If you look at the financial reports, they're filled with internal contradictions. There are 5 or 6 different versions of their finances, and they vary all over the place. Well, who's the adult supervisor for this? This is taxpayer money. Switzerland, the same problem. And we see that in Holland, in Denmark, in Sweden, Norway, all of these countries have this well-entrenched system. And it really comes down to 2 things. What we're told when we raise these is, number one, we support the Palestinian cause, their victims, Israel's occupying them, we have to help them. And so they won't deal with the details, they deal with the I would say, the emotional ideological framework. And the other part of it is they'll say it's not our issue. If it's an Israeli, if it's an embassy based in Tel Aviv or in Israel, they'll say it's the Ramallah office that's doing this. It's the East Jerusalem people that are doing this. So it's the people in Brussels or in Bern who are doing this. And that's true, and the diplomats can't control the whole system, but the question is, are they sending the right messages to the people at the top of the system? And journalists don't generally report this. That's another thing that's going on. And that's changing, but it's changing with difficulty. A lot of the journalists, there's a Dutch journalist the main Dutch journalist based in Israel, is very sympathetic to the Palestinian cause and presents everything, including on these issues, through the lens and the filter and the spin of the Palestinian narrative and the NGO narrative. And that's a serious problem. Slowly we're getting to that, but it continues to be a major issue.
Very disturbing information you've raised. The only positive note I can say is that NGO Monitor is on the job. Dr. Gerald Steinberg, thank you so much for being with us at ILTV.
Thank you, Steve.
Israelis have long been extending their hands to assist other nations in need, and now the Israel organization tells us they've secretly been sending teams to help Christian and Yazidi refugees in northern Iraq. The Israeli Humanitarian Agency has been participating in international relief efforts since 2014 to help survivors of Islamic State violence. One woman we'll call Rachel Weiss to protect her identity is an Israeli-American who specializes in treating victims of sexual violence. Between 5,000 and 7,000 mostly female Yazidis are estimated to have been abducted and enslaved by ISIS since 2014. At least 5,000 are thought to have been slaughtered. slaughtered. Israel's global initiative called Imagining Hope also works to document the experiences of these women and other refugees around the world by filming their testimonies on video. The Israeli initiative is aimed at encouraging the healing process, but the footage could also be used one day to help prosecute the perpetrators of war crimes. About 4,000 Yazidis are still being held captive by ISIS, and thousands of others in northern Iraq and Syria are in danger. Weiss describes the crisis as a genocide and says the ethno-religious group has been forgotten, claiming it's a Jewish duty to help other people going through the same thing that the Jewish people once suffered themselves. The standoff over the Amona settlement outpost is heating up, and today residents angrily ignored the 10 a.m. deadline set by the High Court for them to sign individual pledges to leave their homes peacefully, no matter when they're evicted. The court wanted the non-violence guarantee in writing, regardless of the date they're forced to leave the illegal West Bank outpost. The justices have yet to rule on the state's request to push back the slated December 25th evacuation for another 45 days. But the residents say they not only won't sign, they may cancel their compromise agreement with the government if the postponement isn't approved. The deal states that 24 of Amona's 41 families would be moved to an adjacent plot of land, while the rest would move to a nearby settlement. The state asked for a delay so there's more time to prepare the alternative housing arrangements. Several Amona residents are now accusing the court of trying to blackmail them, since they say their refusal to comply with a demand could leave them and their children homeless or open to prosecution. The court ruled that Amona has to be dismantled because it was built on land owned by Palestinians who are objecting to any additional postponements of the evacuation. The residents of the Amona outpost settlement have been given an ultimatum: sign a non-violence waiver by 10 a.m. today or be forced out. With the December 25th evacuation date looming over everyone's heads, tensions are flaring. Joining me in the studio today are Uri Zaki, the president of the Meretz Party National Assembly, and Simcha Rothman, the legal advisor of the Israeli Movement for Governability and Democracy, to expand on these issues. Thank you guys so much for coming in.
Thank you.
So today, the government is pressuring Amona residents to sign these non-violence pledges. But didn't Amona already allegedly, pledge to leave peacefully with respect to the first agreement? What is the difference here with what we're seeing?
I think what happened today is that the Supreme Court, whose ruling, there were several rulings, but the government got a final ultimatum till the end of this month, till the 25th, if I'm not mistaken, for the Amona outpost to be evacuated. The government today, following the agreement with the Amona residents, asked for postponing of this of the evacuation, and on that background, the Supreme Court said, in order to actually examine whether, because the government got 2 years to make the evacuation, waited till the last moment, and now we're passing the last moment. The Supreme Court said, okay, we'll consider that, but first we need to know that there won't be any violence while the evacuation is taking place.
Now, have there been any changes to the settlement law since the residents agreed not to be violent earlier this week?
To the law that was passed in the Knesset,
yes,
was passed
in the
first.
So these are two different things, but
right.
The law, in the very early stages of this law, Amona was taken out of this law a long time ago. So the law has nothing to do now with the Amona settlement issue. Amona settlement issue is different. They have a different solution. They signed, as you said, they signed for the government. What we see today is the Supreme Court. I can describe it only as something about the ego of the Supreme Court, because there is no legal reason to demand this signature, this resignature, and since it's already today 2 times, because the first time it was until 10 a.m. as you said, what the settlers wrote apparently did not satisfy the court, so they asked for another clarification to be delivered until 5 few.
Now you say, it's unreasonable for them to be pushing the residents to be signing this nonviolence pledge, but in 2006, when families were going to be evacuated from Amona, there was violence that broke out between protesters and the government.
I would just say that the violence was ignited by the police that was evacuated, not by the settlers themselves. And I say that, I guess the viewers know my background. I worked for B'Tselem. I represent, as you said, I'm a leading figure in an Israeli left party that sees the settlement enterprise and Amona itself as illegal and as an existential threat, if you want, on the state of Israel as a national Jewish homeland and a democracy. But there was a brutal attack by the police using horse riders and clubs, and even B'Tselem, that is known for its criticism towards the settlement enterprise and settlements, was very harsh in its criticism against the Israeli police and government for the acts that were done in Amona in 2006.
So what guarantee is there not being violence? If it's obviously not a one-sided issue here. Violence comes because of two different groups clashing with one another.
The fact that the settlers of Amona and the government agreed to move to other place and to find a solution, a legal solution to build Amona. When people move, there will be no need for police. There will be no need for a conflict. And even a violent policeman or a violent protester cannot ignite something that is not there. And the issues that will be, if it will be a peaceful moving, there will be no police, there will be no clash, and there probably won't be any violence. So the fact that the Supreme Court make this demand is without any authority, without any...
Let's talk about the underlying issue now, right? Obviously, the violence is related to this in of itself. There are those who think that Amona itself is a distraction from this larger underlying goal of the settlements bill, which is why I brought it up beforehand, which is to legalize outposts and settlements that would otherwise be illegal. How credible are these fears?
Of this law passing? Look, honestly, I'm not sure that Amona was the trigger for this legislation, which was a political mean for both the Prime Minister and the Minister of Education, Mr. Bennett, who's the leader of the Beit Yehudi party, which is associated with the settlers, to lower the tensions vis-a-vis Amona and its leadership. If it will pass, we discussed this before. Benny Begin, the son of Menachem Begin, one of the leaders of the old Likud party, I would call it, called this legislation as basically legalizing theft or legalizing robbery. Because what it says that any Jewish outpost that was built on, and I emphasize Jewish because it only refers to basically to Jewish settlements, that was built on privately owned lands, and this was done knowingly, will be legalized by the state. Now this goes against the basic fundamentals of our system, and therefore, if that will be the consequence of Amona, I still think that there is a good chance that it won't pass eventually. But if that will be the case, I think would put the Israeli legal system and the Israeli claims, those I agree with and those I don't agree with, in a very problematic situation vis-a-vis, first of all, the Israeli judicial branch, but also vis-a-vis the world. And we see already what's going on as a result of this legislation attempt.
I think that Benny Begin, who was trying to lead the solution for the Bedouin in the Negev, which basically was to try to legalize hundreds of thousands of illegal houses.
But not on privately owned land.
Built on land that was not owned by the builders and by the Bedouin tribes, was not belong to them, and it was ruled in all the courts that discussed with it. And he said, legally we can kick them out. The court said we can kick them out, but there is a problem here. We need to find a solution, and he worked very hard. He wasn't so much successful with it, but he was trying to convince everyone to solve the Bedouin illegal buildings in the Negev in a certain way that will give benefits to people who got into the land that wasn't theirs, and build on that. But that was Benny Begin, what he tried to do last time he was minister. And now, for some reason, he objects to this law. This law does not it's not taking care of Amona. Amona was taken out of this law long time ago. This law takes care of more than about 4,000 houses that were built on land that its owners and the ownership of lands in Judea and Samaria is a very complicated matter, and this law supposed to solve the problem made by Israeli government. Amona, the houses you mentioned before, in 2006 were demolished in Amona. Those houses were built by Israeli government with money paid from the Israeli government, and then were demolished by the same Israeli government. So to say that the people got into land and without permission and were still in land, it's not true. The government built with mistake, without mistake, we don't know yet. We might never know. But the law is supposed to solve the problem and give compensation. The people who lost their land never got compensation. The law will give them compensation.
All right, well, guys, listen, unfortunately...
just in one sentence.
I'm going to give you, in one sentence, I'll let you respond to this.
I think there's no comparison. I'm not here to defend Benny Begin, whose views I'm very much in opposition to, but it's just not fair to say that there's no complication about ownership of lands on these specific areas which the law covers. These are exactly places where you have not state-owned or state-declared lands, but rather privately owned lands with claimers to that land, and those outposts were built on privately owned lands. That's theft.
Well, guys, we're going to have to end the interview here. Obviously, this is a very heated topic for many, and we're just going to have to wait and see what happens. All right, thank you for coming in.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Now, this story may be hard to believe. Israeli neuroscientists have just come up with amazing new technology that helps people who suffer certain kinds of paralysis to regain control of their immobilized limbs. What's even more incredible is that the patients don't even have to endure exhausting physical therapy. All they have to do is sit still and let Israeli technology work its magic. Tel Aviv University just completed a successful clinical trial in which subjects strapped on virtual reality headsets with on-screen images of both hands. Whenever they made motions with their right hands, VR showed their left hands doing the same, even though they hadn't moved. Later, the subjects put motorized gloves on their left hands that physically mirrored all movements made by the right. The subjects' left hands were later found to move more effectively. The Israeli neuroscientists say that's because the subjects' brains were fooled into believing the left hand voluntarily did something it hadn't, and essentially learned a physical skill. This discovery could have a major impact on helping people experiencing weakness or paralysis in one of their two paired limbs. That includes stroke victims, for example, who often need to regain function of their motor skills. Best of all, researchers also believe the technique could have even wider applications in other fields, such as pain management. The Israeli army may still be against smoking marijuana while on duty, but it looks like they're on a mission to make the lives of their soldiers easier off base. The IDF has just approved a new reform to relax penalties against troops caught using cannabis while on leave. Aaron, what does this mean in terms of general cannabis use?
Well, Israel has had a long history of understanding when it has come to cannabis. You know, they've been at the forefront of cannabis research since the 60s. So I think what we're seeing now is the government's attempt to find a compromise between altogether forgiving, delinquent behavior and illegal behavior and ruining somebody's life over something reasonably small.
It's just been announced that Israeli soldiers will no longer face automatic court-martials or 2-month jail terms if they only lit up a few times while off duty. If they're suspected of heavier use, though, they'd still have to undergo frequent testing and prosecution. The lessening of restrictions also does not apply to any troops caught being stoned while on duty. 128 Israeli soldiers were prosecuted for the use of narcotics in 2015. The Army says its new plan isn't meant to condone cannabis use in any way, but is aimed at offering soldiers the opportunity to complete their national service without disruption or being haunted by criminal records after they return to civilian life. It's still very much against the law to smoke cannabis in Israel, although the Jewish state has one of the most advanced policies in the world on the use of cannabis for medical purposes.
And now for our Hebrew word of the day. Hanukkah is right around the corner, and while it may be known as a festival of lights, Jews are no stranger to lighting candles for all sorts of reasons. So today's word is menorah, or a candelabrum or lamp. The menorah can be seen in Jewish and Israeli carvings, sculptures, money, mosaics, and more. Coming from the root noor, meaning flare, a menorah is something to hold the flares. Now, it's no mystery why the menorah might be representative of Israel and the Jewish people. The Torah tells us to be a light upon the nations, and as Mahatma Gandhi said, even a single menorah dispels the deepest darkness. Just don't get confused between the menorah and the Chanukiah. While the menorah commonly has a total of 7 branches, the Chanukiah always has a total of 9. But we'll leave that explanation for the next word. Alright, let's go ahead and take a look at the weather forecast.
ILTV's weather forecast is sponsored by Adopt a Savta, taking care of Israel's lonely Holocaust survivors.
The weekend has arrived, and tonight will be partly cloudy with a chance of rain and a low of 50 or 10 degrees Celsius. Friday and Saturday will be mostly cloudy with little change in temperatures. The high will be around 62 or 17 degrees Celsius. All right, everybody, that's it for today's news. Today's exchange rate is 3.82 shekels to the American dollar. Remember to sign up for our daily newsletter at iltv.tv. Thanks for watching, and see you tonight.